The crack of Mordecai Grimm's whip split the morning air like thunder, and Celestin Raven's scream followed immediately after. Blood seeped through her torn dress as she collapsed against the wooden post, her wrists raw from the rope that bound her to the town's punishment pillar. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "No more pain, my ribs are already broken." The crowd of Thornwick Village gathered in a cruel circle, their faces twisted with righteous indignation. They called her a witch, a temptress, a woman who dared to heal with herbs when the town's physician had failed. But Vex Nightingale knew better. He'd watched from the shadows as she'd saved his sister from fever, as she'd helped birth healthy babies when others would have died, as she'd shown nothing but kindness to a town that now bayed for her blood. Grimm raised the whip again, his cold eyes gleaming with sadistic pleasure. "The devil's work demands the devil's payment," he snarled, the leather weapon singing through the air. But before it could find its mark, a massive hand caught Grimm's wrist with bone-crushing force. The crowd fell silent as Vex Nightingale emerged. From their midst, like an avenging angel, his 6'4" frame casting a long shadow over the punishment ground. "Touch her again," Vex said, his voice low and deadly, "and I'll break every bone in your worthless body." Grimm's face went pale. Even in his position as the town's self-appointed moral authority, he knew better than to challenge Vex Nightingale directly. The man was a force of nature, a former outlaw who'd settled in Thornwick after inheriting his father's ranch, bringing with him a reputation that made grown men cross themselves and pray. "She's a witch, Nightingale," Grimm stammered, his bravado crumbling. "The town has spoken. She must be cleansed of her sins." "The only sin here," Vex growled, twisting Grimm's wrist until the whip fell from nerveless fingers, "is what you bastards are doing to an innocent woman." He released the man with such force that Grimm stumbled backward into the crowd. With swift, sure movements, Vex drew his knife and cut the ropes binding Celestin to the post. She collapsed forward, and he caught her gently, his calloused hands surprisingly tender as they cradled her battered form. "I've got you," he murmured against her ear, his voice a stark contrast to the violence he'd just threatened. "Nobody's going to hurt you again." Celestin looked up into his storm-gray eyes, seeing something there that she'd never witnessed in another human being, complete and absolute protection. Her ribs screamed with pain, her back was a map of welts and cuts, but in his arms, she felt safer than she had in months. "Why?" she whispered, her fingers clutching at his leather vest. "Why are you helping me?" "Because," he said, lifting her as easily as a child, "in a world full of cruelty, someone has to stand for what's right." The crowd began to murmur, their bloodlust slowly transforming into uncertainty. Vex Nightingale was not a man to cross, and his protection of the accused witch threw their carefully constructed narrative into chaos. "You can't take her," Grimm called out, finding his voice again. "The town council has decreed." "The town council," Vex interrupted, his voice carrying across the square like a death sentence, "can go to hell." He turned toward his horse, Celestin secure in his arms, but paused to address the crowd one final time. "Anyone who follows us, anyone who tries to harm her again, will answer to me. And I promise you, that's not a conversation any of you want to have." As he mounted his stallion with practiced ease, still holding Celestin protectively against his chest, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The world might be full of cruelty, but perhaps, just perhaps, it also contained unexpected angels who wore the faces of former devils. The ride to his ranch began in silence, but it was a silence full of promise, heavy with the weight of a protection that felt as solid and eternal as the mountains that surrounded their small, judgmental town. The Nightingale Ranch sprawled across the valley like a promise of peace, its weathered buildings nestled against rolling hills that seemed to stretch toward heaven itself. Vex guided his horse through the gate with one hand, the other never leaving its protective position around Celestine's waist. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, her body finally surrendering to the trauma it had endured. "Easy now," he murmured as they approached the main house, a sturdy log structure that spoke of both strength and unexpected comfort. "We're home." Home. The word echoed strangely in Celestine's mind. She hadn't had a real home since her grandmother's death 3 years ago, when she'd inherited both the old woman's healing knowledge and the suspicion that came with it. Now cradled against this dangerous stranger's chest, the concept felt both foreign and desperately welcome. Vex dismounted with fluid grace, lifting her down with the same careful attention he might show a wounded bird. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair. "Dear Lord in heaven," the woman gasped, taking in Celestine's condition. "Vex, what have those monsters done?" "Nothing they won't pay for, Cordelia," he replied grimly. "Can you prepare the guest room? And bring your medical supplies." Cordelia Marsh had been the Nightingale Ranch's housekeeper for nearly 2 decades, but she was more family than employee. She'd nursed Vex through his own dark period after he'd left his outlaw life behind, and she recognized the protective fury burning in his eyes now. "The blue room's ready," she said, already moving toward the stairs. "I'll fetch hot water and clean bandages." Vex carried Celestine up the wooden staircase, each step measured and careful. The guest room was a sanctuary of soft blues and whites, with a large window that looked out over wildflower meadows. He laid her gently on the bed, his hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. "I need to examine your wounds," he said quietly. "Cordelia will help you, and I'll wait outside." "No." Celestine's voice was barely a whisper, but her hand caught his wrist with surprising strength. "Please, don't leave me alone." Something in her tone, a vulnerability that went deeper than physical pain, made his chest tighten. He'd seen that look before, in his own mirror during the worst days of his past. It was the expression of someone who'd been betrayed by the world so completely that solitude felt like a death sentence. "I'll stay," he promised, pulling a chair beside the bed. "But I'll turn around while Cordelia tends to you." As Cordelia worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning and bandaging the worst of the whip marks, Celestine found herself studying the broad line of Vex's shoulders, the way he held himself perfectly still except for the slight tension that spoke of barely controlled rage. "Why do they call you a witch?" he asked quietly, his back still turned to give her privacy. "Because I can heal people," she replied, wincing as Cordelia applied salve to a particularly deep cut. "Because I know which herbs stop bleeding, which teas can break a fever, which poultices draw poison from wounds. In a town where knowledge is feared, helping people makes you dangerous. And Grim? What's his particular hatred of you?" Celestine was quiet for so long that Vex almost turned around. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with old pain. "His son died last winter. Consumption. I tried everything I knew, but some sicknesses are beyond herbs and prayers. He needed a doctor, real medicine from the city. But Grim blamed me instead of his own pride. So he decided to make you pay for his failure as a father." "The whole town decided," she corrected. "Fear spreads faster than healing ever could." Cordelia finished her work and nodded to Vex that he could turn around. Celestine looked small and fragile against the white pillows, but there was steel in her green eyes that spoke of a spirit unbroken despite everything she'd endured. "Rest now," Vex said, his voice gentler than she'd thought possible. "Tomorrow we'll figure out how to keep you safe." As exhaustion finally claimed her, Celestine's last conscious thought was that perhaps she'd found something rarer than safety. She'd found someone willing to fight the entire world. 2-3 days passed before Celestine was strong enough to leave her bed, And when she finally ventured downstairs, she found Vex in his study, cleaning a collection of firearms with methodical precision. The late afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, illuminating wanted posters scattered across his desk, all bearing his name, all dated from years past. "So the stories are true," she said from the doorway, her voice steady despite the flutter of nervousness in her chest. He looked up, his storm-gray eyes unreadable. "Which stories would those be?" "That Vex Nightingale used to ride with the Crimson Serpent gang. That you robbed trains and banks across 3 territories. That you killed 7 men in a single gunfight in Deadwood." "8 men," he corrected quietly, setting down the rifle he'd been cleaning. "And it wasn't a fight, it was a massacre. They'd cornered a family, planning to do things that decent folks don't speak of. I stopped them." Celestin moved into the room, her healing ribs protesting the movement but her curiosity stronger than her pain. "That doesn't sound like the action of a cold-blooded outlaw." "The world ain't black and white, Celestin. Sometimes good men do bad things, and sometimes bad men do what's right." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked his land. "I spent 5 years running from the law, living by my guns, taking what I needed to survive. But I never hurt innocent people, never. Took from those who couldn't afford to lose." "What changed?" Vex was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "My sister, Luna, she was everything good in this world, kind, gentle, believing the best in everyone. The law caught up with me in a town called Bitter Creek. There was a shootout, and she—" He stopped, his hands clenching into fists against the window frame. "She died trying to protect me from a deputy's bullet." Understanding flooded through Celestin like a physical blow. "That's why you saved me. You couldn't save her, so you—" "No." He turned, and she saw something raw and honest in his eyes. "At first, maybe. But the moment I saw you standing there, taking their hatred without breaking, using your last breath to beg for mercy, ... You weren't Luna. You were something else entirely. You were strength wearing the mask of gentleness." Heat rose in Celestin's cheeks, but she held his gaze. "And what are you, Vex Nightingale?" "A man trying to atone for his sins by protecting someone who doesn't deserve the world's cruelty." The tension between them stretched taut as a bowstring until Cordelia's voice broke the moment. "Riders coming up the road," she called from the kitchen. "Looks like trouble." Vex was at the window in 2 strides, his expression darkening as he counted the approaching horses. Grim and 6 others. "They're armed." "They've come for me," Celestin whispered, fear creeping into her voice despite her efforts to stay calm. "Like hell they have." Vex moved to his gun cabinet, selecting weapons with the efficiency of long practice. "Cordelia, take Celestin upstairs to my room. Bar the door and don't open it unless you hear my voice." "I won't hide while you face them alone," Celestin protested. "You will if you want to live." His voice brooked no argument. "These men don't want justice, Celestin. They want blood, and they'll use any excuse to spill it." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, and Celestin could see the riders through the window, Grim in the lead, his face twisted with righteous fury, the others following like wolves scenting prey. "Vex," she said, catching his arm as he headed for the door. "Don't become the man you used to be. Not for me." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her eyes. "The man I used to be never had anything worth protecting. That changes everything." As Cordelia hurried her upstairs, Celestin heard Vex step onto the porch, heard his voice carry across the yard with deadly calm. "That's far enough, Grim. State your business or get off my land." From the upstairs window, she watched the confrontation unfold, her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether the fragile sanctuary they built together would survive the storm that had finally found them. "We've come for the witch, Nightingale," Grim called out, his voice carrying across the yard with false bravado. 6 armed men flanked him, their faces hard with mob mentality. "Hand her over, and there won't be any trouble." Vex stood motionless on his porch, hands loose at his sides, every inch the predator he'd once been. "Only trouble I see is 7 fools on horses thinking they can ride onto my land and make demands." "The town council has voted," declared Jasper. Kane, the banker who'd always resented Vex's independence. "She's to face trial for witchcraft and consorting with dark forces." "We have the legal right." "Your legal right," Vex interrupted, his voice deadly quiet, "ends at my property line. And your kangaroo court has about as much authority as a snake's belly." From the upstairs window, Celestin watched the scene unfold. With growing dread, she could see the tension in every line of Vex's body, could practically feel the violence crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. These men hadn't come to talk. They'd come to drag her back for another beating, another public spectacle to feed their bloodthirsty sense of righteousness. "Stand aside, Nightingale," Grim snarled, his horse prancing nervously beneath him. "We know she's here. Cordelia was seen buying extra supplies in town. And if she is here?" Vex took a single step forward, and several of the men shifted uncomfortably. In their saddles. "What exactly do you plan to do about it?" "We plan to take her back where she belongs," said Deputy Marcus Stone, a man whose badge gave him courage he wouldn't otherwise possess. "Dead or alive makes no difference to us." That was the wrong thing to say. Celestin saw the change in Vex immediately, the way his shoulders went loose, the way his right hand drifted almost casually toward his gun. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of cornered animals who decided they had nothing left to lose. "Cordelia," she whispered urgently, "I have to stop this." "You'll do no such thing," the older woman replied firmly. "Vex knows what he's about." But Celestin was already moving, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs as she hurried toward the stairs. She couldn't let him become a killer again for her sake, couldn't let him damn his soul to save her body. She burst through the front door just as Grim raised his rifle. "Stop!" she cried, stumbling onto the porch. "I'll go with you. Just ... Nobody needs to die for this. Celestin, no." Vex's voice was sharp with command, but she was already walking toward the mounted men, her chin held high despite her fear. "I said I'll come," she repeated, looking up at Grim with steady eyes. "But if you take me, you take me alive. No more beatings, no more torture. A fair trial with witnesses who'll speak for my character." Grim's smile was ugly. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, witch." "She is when she's under my protection." Everyone turned to stare at Vex, who'd moved to stand beside Celestin with fluid grace. His hands were still empty, but somehow he seemed more dangerous than if he'd been bristling with weapons. "Here's how this works," he continued conversationally. "You turn those horses around and ride back to town. You tell your council that if they want to put Celestin on trial, they do it proper, with a real judge, not some kangaroo court run by bitter old men looking for someone to blame for their own failures." "And if we refuse?" Deputy Stone demanded. Vex smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Celestin had ever seen. "Then you'll discover why the Crimson Serpent Gang never lost a single member while I rode with them. Some skills, Deputy. You never really forget." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Horses shifted restlessly beneath their riders. Hands drifted toward gun butts and away again. 7 against 1 should have been easy odds, but everyone present knew Vex Nightingale's reputation, knew that legends were born from moments exactly like this one. "Choose carefully," Vex added softly, "because once this dance starts, it doesn't stop until only one side is left standing." The moment hung suspended like a drop of water on a blade's edge. 7 armed men faced one, But the mathematics of violence had never been about numbers alone. Grimm's finger twitched on his rifle trigger, and Vex moved. What happened next would be talked about in Thornwick for decades. Vex's guns appeared in his hands as if summoned by magic, iron singing from leather faster than thought itself. His first shot took Grimm's rifle clean out of his hands, sending the weapon spinning through the air. His second shattered Deputy Stone's gun before the man could clear leather. Next shots won't be so charitable, Vex warned, his voice steady. As Stone, despite the smoking pistols in his hands, but Rafe Dustin, Grimm's youngest and most hot-headed follower, panicked. His gun cleared its holster in a desperate draw, muzzle swinging toward Celestin. Time slowed to a crawl as Vex realized he couldn't reach her in time, couldn't pivot his own weapons fast enough to stop what was coming. Celestin saw the gun turning toward her, saw death approaching with metallic certainty. But instead of closing her eyes, instead of accepting the inevitable, she did something that surprised everyone present. She stepped directly into Vex's line of fire, giving him the clear shot he needed. The trust implicit in that action, the absolute faith that he wouldn't miss, that he would save her even at the cost of her temporarily blocking his aim, hit Vex harder than any bullet ever could. His left-hand gun spoke once, and Dustin's weapon flew from nerveless fingers as the bullet shattered bone and sinew. The young man's scream cut through the afternoon air, and suddenly the fight went out of the remaining men like air from a punctured bladder. They weren't facing a reformed outlaw anymore. They were facing the legend himself, and legends didn't lose gunfights. "Pack it up, boys," called out Jonas Webb, the town's blacksmith and the only man among them with an ounce of sense. "This ain't worth dying for." "We can't just leave," Grimm protested, cradling his bruised hands. The town expects us to come back alive," Webb interrupted. "And right now, that's looking less and less likely." As the men helped Dustin into his saddle, his right hand wrapped in a hastily torn piece of shirt, Grimm fixed Vex with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over, Nightingale. She faced justice eventually." "Real justice," Vex corrected, "with a real judge and a proper trial. Anything less than that, and we'll have this conversation again. Only next time, I won't be aiming for hands and weapons." After the riders disappeared over the ridge, Celestin finally allowed her knees to buckle. The adrenaline that had kept her upright through the confrontation drained away all at once, leaving her shaking like a leaf in a storm. Vex was beside her instantly, his guns already holstered, his hands gentle as they helped her to the porch. "Steps, why did you do that?" he asked, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't quite name. "You could have been killed." "So could you," she replied, looking up into his storm-gray eyes. "And I've already been saved once by a man willing to risk everything for a stranger. I wasn't about to let him sacrifice himself for me a second time. I'm not a stranger anymore." "No," she agreed softly. "You're not." The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving. Celestin could see gold flecks in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cool afternoon air. When he reached up to brush a strand of copper hair from her face, his touch was gentle enough to make her breath catch. "Celestin," he began, his voice lower than usual. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." They might have kissed then, might have acknowledged the connection that had been building between them since that first moment in the town square, but Cordelia's voice from the doorway interrupted them. "Much as I hate to break up this touching moment," she said dryly, "we've got more company coming. And these ones don't look like they're from around here." The approaching riders moved with military precision, their horses in perfect formation, dust rising behind them like a banner of intent. Even from a distance, their bearing spoke of authority that went far beyond the petty power of small town. "Bullies, federal marshals," Vex observed quietly, his hand instinctively checking his gun. 3 of them, by the look of it. Celestin felt her heart sink into her boots. If federal law enforcement had come for her, it meant the charges against her had escalated far beyond local accusations of witchcraft. Someone had convinced them she was a genuine threat to public safety. "They're not here for you," Vex said, reading the fear in her expression. "Look at how they're riding, spread out, cautious. They're tracking someone they consider dangerous." As the riders drew closer, Celestin could make out more details. The lead marshal was a woman, tall and stern-faced, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back severely. Her companions flanked her like wolves, hands resting easy on their weapons. The trio stopped at the property line, the lead marshal raising her hand in a gesture of temporary peace. "Vex Nightingale," she called out, her voice carrying clearly. "Across the yard. I'm Marshal Catherine Cross. We need to talk." "Then talk," Vex replied, not moving from his position beside Celestin on the porch. "But you can do it from there?" Marshal Cross dismounted with fluid grace, leaving her companions mounted and alert. "We're not here about old warrants, Nightingale. Those were voided 3 years ago when you provided information about the Crimson Serpent's remaining members." This was news to Celestin, who looked at Vex with surprise. He'd never mentioned cooperating with federal authorities, never spoken of betraying his former gang members. "They were planning to rob a church full of families during Christmas service," he said quietly, seeing her expression. "Some lines you don't cross, no matter what colors you use to ride under." Marshal Cross continued her approach, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. "We're here about recent events in Thornwick. Reports have reached us of a woman being publicly tortured for alleged witchcraft. The federal government takes a dim view of vigilante justice and religious persecution." Relief flooded through Celestin so suddenly she felt dizzy. "You're here to help me?" "We're here to investigate," Cross corrected. "If what we've heard is true, certain citizens of Thornwick are going to face federal charges for assault, kidnapping, and violation of civil rights. In the territories, that's a hanging offense." "And if what you've heard isn't true?" Vex asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Then we'll sort that out too." Cross's eyes were sharp as she studied both of them. "But I've got to tell you, Mr. Nightingale, the woman who sent word to us painted a pretty convincing picture of what happened in that town square." "What woman?" Celestin asked, confusion replacing relief. "Martha Quillen. Says she's a friend of yours. Elderly lady with more spine than a porcupine and a tongue sharp enough to cut glass." Celestin gasped. Martha was her grandmother's oldest friend, one of the few people in town who'd shown her any kindness. She'd thought the old woman had stayed silent out of fear. "Martha saw everything," she whispered. "But she never spoke up during the attack. She was smart enough to know that speaking up then would have gotten her strung up next to you," Cross observed. "But she was also brave enough to ride to the territorial capital and demand federal intervention. Said she couldn't live with herself if she stayed quiet while innocent blood was spilled." Vex felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. Federal marshals meant official justice, real courts, the rule of law instead of mob rule. It meant Celestin might actually be safe. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we go to town and have some very serious conversations with Mordecai Grimm and his friends," Cross replied grimly. "And Miss Raven here gives us her testimony about what was done to her." "I'll go with her," Vex said immediately. "I figured you might." Cross almost smiled. "From what I hear, you've become quite the protector. It's a good look on you, Nightingale. Much better than the old one." As they prepared to ride to Thornwick together, Celestin felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope for actual justice, backed by the full weight of federal law. The federal investigation took 3 weeks to complete, and when it was over, Mordecai Grimm found himself facing 20 years in federal prison for assault, kidnapping, and inciting a riot. Deputy. Stone lost his badge and faced 5 years for abuse of authority. The others received lesser sentences, but the message was clear. Vigilante justice would not be tolerated in the territories. Celestin's name was officially cleared of all charges, with Marshall Cross's final report noting that Miss Raven's actions constituted legitimate medical practice using traditional herbal remedies with no evidence of supernatural or criminal activity. But more than legal vindication, the investigation had revealed something beautiful. There were more friends in Thornwick than enemies. Martha Quillen had been the first to speak up, but she wasn't the last. Dr. Ezra Winters, who'd been out of town during the attack, testified that he'd consulted with Celestin numerous times and found her knowledge invaluable. 3 different families swore that she'd saved their children's lives. Even the pastor, Reverend Timothy Caldwell, admitted that he'd been pressured by Grimm's faction and deeply regretted not speaking up sooner. Now, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Celestin stood in the kitchen of the Nightingale Ranch, helping Cordelia prepare dinner for an unusual gathering. Tonight, for the first time since the attack, she was hosting guests from town: Martha, Dr. Winters, and several of the families who defended her. "You're nervous," Vex observed, appearing in the doorway with an armload of firewood. "Terrified," she admitted, wiping her hands on her apron. "It's been so long since I felt welcome anywhere." What if nothing?" he interrupted gently, setting the wood down and moving to stand behind her. His hands settled on her shoulders and she leaned back against his solid warmth. "These people came forward to defend you when it mattered. They want to be here." Over the past month, as the investigation had unfolded and her name had been cleared, something else had been growing between them. What had started as protection had deepened into something richer, more complex. They'd spent long evenings talking by the fire, sharing stories of their pasts, their fears, their dreams. They'd discovered that 2 wounded souls could heal each other in ways that neither had imagined possible. "Vex," she said quietly, turning in his arms to face him. Tonight, after everything settles down, what happens to us?" "That depends," he replied, his storm gray eyes serious. "What do you want to happen?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching wagons announced their guests' arrival. But as they moved apart to greet their visitors, Celestin caught his hand. "I want to stay," she whispered, "here with you, if you'll have me." His answer was in his eyes, in the way his fingers tightened around hers, in the smile that transformed his entire face from dangerous to devastating. The evening that followed was everything Celestin had dreamed of but never dared hope for. Laughter filled the house as Martha regaled everyone with stories of her confrontation with the territorial governor. Dr. Winters and Celestin discussed medical techniques with the enthusiasm of true colleagues. Children played by the fire while their parents spoke of community, of healing, of building something better than what had come before. Later, after the guests had departed and Cordelia had retired to her room, Vex and Celestin found themselves alone on the front porch, watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. "I have something for you," Vex said quietly, pulling a small wooden box from his pocket. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was a ring, not elaborate or expensive, but clearly made with care. The band was silver, set with a small emerald that caught the moonlight like captured starfire. "It was my mother's," he said softly. "The only thing of value my father ever gave her, and the only thing I kept when I left home. I've been carrying it for 15 years, waiting for someone worth giving it to." Celestin's breath caught as he knelt before her chair, the notorious gunfighter transformed into something achingly vulnerable. "Marry me, Celestin Raven. Let me spend the rest of my life keeping you safe from a world that doesn't deserve your kindness." "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Vex Nightingale, let's build something beautiful together." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Celestin realized that sometimes the greatest love stories began not with passion, but with protection. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the man who saved you from the world's cruelty turned out to be the one who could teach you how to love again. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the sound seemed less lonely than hopeful, a wild song of two hearts finding each other in the vast, beautiful wilderness of possibility.